We'll be having fewer minutes than originally anticipated for questions and answers, and I would hope a discussion. So what I will do is open the floor. I won't ask any questions of my own, despite the fact I've got several that I've been dying to ask. But to participants here, but also those who are joining us remotely. I'll take a few questions and comments, asking everyone to be as brief as possible so we will be able to fit in several. And before you do ask your question or make your comment, please introduce yourselves for the benefit of those who might not know you here, but also for those who are joining us. I think the first we have two questions here. Maybe Sheila first.
Thank you. Thank you. Sheila Page, ODI. I wanted to question the concept of value chain. It's two-dimensional, and trade is not two-dimensional. There are networks of trade, meshes, if you want to keep the metallic thing. Is it really sensible? Max made the point that sticking a protectionist barrier affects the whole economy, not just trade. It doesn't just affect the whole economy. It affects your neighbours' economies, your competitors' economies. I'm thinking now of my first project with Nigel, where we were looking at the effect of South Africa on its neighbourhood, which remains important. And you discussed the SADC industrialization. Is it really useful to think about value chains? Because it's very limiting when one's looking at the effects of trade measures to look only at the two countries directly involved.
Thank you, Dirk de Velde, ODI. I really enjoyed all the presentations. I'd like to ask a question to the whole panel, actually, but it was an issue that Jody raised. It's about taking back control. And I think we need to, as trade economists, be much smarter at thinking around what it means, taking back control. And you can think about, of course, taking back control through controlling the flows of trade. But I think what is really meant is thinking about the taking back control of the redistribution or the distribution of the gains from trade. And I think here we need to just be much smarter in thinking about what are the policy options, that we don't think about tariffs on trade, but we actually think about the measures that Nigel was talking about at the end. It's about cluster policies and the like, and that's the way we actually take back control of globalization.
Thank you. Thanks, Dick. Well, I have one more here.
Hi there, Liam Campling, Queen Mary, University of London. I was wondering if one of the things that's missing from the picture is the original focus of the global value chain or global production network kind of frameworks, of which there are debates, is the question of the power of firms. Obviously it's there, hidden in the background, but none of you have really kind of taken that on fully. And that links to the second point, which is about the question of the capture of value. And very often we use value added as a notion that somehow Apple adds huge amounts of value. Actually, no, it's capturing value from suppliers through the chain because of its monopolistic position. And I think that needs to be taken into more serious account.
Very interesting. Dr. Gusoriak, advance.
Peter Holmes from Sussex University. Fascinating series of presentations. A couple of quick observations. On an example of leapfrogging, when Max and I visited Vietnam a few years ago, we were very struck by some of the people we met. There was a guy working on computer-assisted design for Nissan. They had no car factories there, but they were working directly with Osaka on the design. The production came later. It was a good example of that. But I think the one issue that I keep saying this every time I go to these meetings, but we always talk about adaptation and adjustment. And our sort of old-fashioned economics actually tells us that there'll be people who are going to be permanently damaged by the fact of the hexarollin, of all the stolper standards and thing. And I don't know how we really face that. And one thing which actually follows from what you were saying just now is I said just a question, is there a possibility that the kind of sort of adjustment strategies that we're likely to adopt are going to actually worsen the inequalities, in the sense that, as in Vietnam, there'll be people who can participate in the the computer-assisted design projects. There were the people that won't. And in order to sort of upgrade, you'll be focusing on the clusters where you can do the things that work. And is there a risk that the best you can do is in fact going to be to focus on, the skilled? In South Africa, you've got some very high skill set, and you've got a lot of people with very few skills. And if you're really going to get, putting the value for money wise, you put it into the areas where the return is highest. Is that going to create a further backlash? That's the question.
Thank you. I'll take one question which has come online, and then we'll have the panel respond quite briefly to this, and we'll have probably what might be the final round after. We've got Neil McCulloch, who is asking, well, specifically to Max and Nigel, but the panelists could certainly join in, is, do you think that increased protection in Africa is justified to encourage the shift towards greater domestic value added? If not, what policies should be used, or is this in fact the wrong goal? So, to the panelists, who would wish to begin? You may address all of the interventions as you wish. Nigel?
Sure. Perhaps just to start off maybe with Sheila's question and around, are regional value chains, global value chains, are they really useful constructs from a policy perspective? And I would say that they, from a microeconomic level, they are, in the sense that it allows a particular focus on addressing the some of the market failures that exist. So maybe an example which we're looking at the moment: South Africa imports roughly 1 million tons of soya every year. South Africa is not a great place for growing soya. However, a number of our neighbours are, but due to hefty border issues, we do not import soya from our neighbours. We import it from South America or Europe or wherever deep sea imports come from. So I think what we're looking at is, if we look at perhaps, we're looking specifically, Zambia is potentially a low-cost producer if one can get agglomeration factors happening. Why don't we try and replace our imports from Brazil with imports from the region? And can we get the price points down to a level where we can do that competitively enough to be able to compete with Brazilian imports? So that would be an example of where I think the region, if we had a better functioning region in terms of logistics and border issues, we'd be able to, we'd have a far better functioning region, and these value chains would work more effectively. So I think that would perhaps be an area which we...
still affect Brazil, so it's not just a chain.
Sure. But if we can do it cost-effective, if we can do it competitively, it's certainly of great benefit to the region. So, okay, that's just on the taking back control, and I think your comment on the, using the new tools, I think absolutely, and I think certainly in African context, I think the need to really grow institutions and strengthen the capacity of institutions to be able to carry out many of these interventions that are required to support support the market. I think that's probably key. I think perhaps just a quick comment on Liam's point around surely the power of the firms and the way that they capture value. How does this play into it? Perhaps a very quick comment just on something that is coming through more and more at a regional level is perhaps what we're calling the missing middle, where we're seeing perhaps at the high end a dominance of multinationals or large corporates, and particularly in a southern African position, certainly South African corporates, and then obviously a myriad of micro survivalist firms, but very, very few domestic firms that have the capability to enjoy the economies of scale to export. And I think that's certainly of big concern. And I think that voice is very much missing in a policy context in the region, and is a big challenge. Peter's comment, I think, just on how do you, from a policy level, perhaps start to influence and give some direction to where the benefits, which sectors or which areas can offer the highest benefits. I think perhaps again from a sectoral level, we are really trying to understand that and to engage with the private sector in a South African context, and perhaps create the incentives to drive skills. Something like our work on the BPO sector would be a good example of where we really trying to incentivize specific skills and very specialized skills in the BPO sector to take advantage of that. And obviously India and others have done that very well. And then, yeah.
Maybe Judy.
Perhaps, yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, I certainly agree with your point, Sheila, that we're moving. It's more about networks and tiers of suppliers, and I think that's what we've tried to get across in the publication, is that things have been sliced up so much, and some entry-level positions are no longer available, and you've got in some cases you have specialisation in particular services, and some firms are beginning to branch out across countries but within the same sector. So I think, we do pick up on that in the publication. And, there are, that it brings, the issues around who to support, how to support, and all of that gets a bit more complicated. On your point, Dirk, about clustering and kind of local governance and institutional development, working with business associations, I absolutely agree, and but it's still not easy. And I think your point, Peter, that there are winners and losers, and some people are permanently disadvantaged. I think it's still quite challenging to do. I mean, there are really quite profound labour market implications because of the rise of GVCs, and I still don't think we've got a handle on them just yet. But one point I would make is that often we talk about social upgrading, economic upgrading, social upgrading, but something that I've come across more recently and working with others is the point about societal upgrading. So that's different, and I think it is related to the point, both of your points, and that is something that does need to be addressed. And on your point, Liam, about the control and power and the race to the bottom. I mean, this is how I'm interpreting. So you've got large buyers. They have they're extremely powerful. They dominate the market. So there is this issue around kind of a race to the bottom, the trade and tax issues. We do pick up on that in the publication, and the kind of work that the OECD is trying to do to rectify that. And there have been more recent developments there. But competition policy and trying to trying to avoid this damaging competition, I think, is we've touched on it, but we could do more.
Thanks. I would hope that the question from Neil about the desirability or the rise of protection by African countries to ensure that there is greater local value added. I would hope that someone could address this. Max?
Yes, we'll focus on that. I mean, I think the general was the area where protectionism is any instances where it's justified. I think that, I will start from a personal point of view. I said that in general it's no. I mean, I would probably, but this is what sort of belief I have. But I think that there are clearly probably some theoretical analysis that says, well, you can protect and create the skills, etc., and then compete. That is a sort of theory. And also they said, with the political message, no, that the protectionism should be for a short period. But basically what we know is that short period is extended indefinitely. And I would take the case of my own country, where the car manufacturing sector has been an infant industry for the last 70 years. So actually, my father is younger than the car industry manufacturing in Argentina. So, and that is a sort of idea of protecting, and it has been 70 years where Argentine consumers have been paying cars twice the price that could have been paid abroad. So that is a seizable number in terms of welfare. But also I think that protectionism, I would say that even doesn't work in the context of value chain. I mean, with this idea where, as I said, I mean, this not longer this unidimension of trade, but actually this idea of a network where a protectionism measure on a particular link affect the whole network and also affect back into the country that may have put the measure. And this is pointed to your point, Sheila, about whether of the effects of protectionism into the domestic economy. You're right. I mean, the effects goes beyond the domestic economy. But I think that the message, stressing the message that the effects of protectionism is affecting your own economy, is what eventually is the spearhead actually to attack the protectionism. I mean, rather than say that it's going to affect other countries, because at the end we can say I don't care about the other countries, but saying that this is going to at the end affect our own country is probably a very powerful message to deliver.
Thank you. So I will not touch on the first two interventions because I think they've been sufficiently well addressed, but I can say a word around this idea of protectionism, adding to that, and then the points by Leo and Peter. And on the protectionism, actually, exactly because we have automation and digitalization of production, if the effect of imposing, say, local content requirements or of other forms of localization must be really thought through in detail, because they might just push companies to automate increasingly. So you might retain jobs at home, but for robots and not for people. And that's really where, and I think actually Jody and her team are doing an incredible work in trying to really understand and bring to to the policy makers the knowledge of what in this 21st century economy changes and how applying this 20th century model type of protections might actually have unwanted negative effects. In terms of the capture that you can have in global value chains, I totally agree that it's an important topic to work on. But we also have sufficient knowledge to know where this capture happens. And normally you need three characteristics. The knowledge has to be codified. It has to be transferred, possibly in a book. It has to be something that is well established, mature. And that you have to have low skills of the suppliers, so that there really needs to be this transfer, hand-holding. And then it normally happens in areas of the economy where you do not have product distinctiveness, where you compete on prices. And that type of economy exists in a lot of established sectors, but also in new sectors. For instance, before I referred to the platform economy, and if you come in downstream as a downstream player, you risk to be captured in these modularity traps, precisely where there is little product distinctiveness and you are locked down there. But the economy is much bigger than that. And one characteristic that we are seeing more and more is that shocks are sudden, unpredictable, and disruptive. So this type of relationships can be wiped out by new business models. So what does this... and so what basically happens is that what we see is that the type of businesses that are able to thrive are those where, as I was saying before, companies really understand what is their competitive advantage and trying to really focus on that and to understand how to create interdependencies by really specializing and becoming extremely knowledgeable and competitive on that. So what this, however, means is that, as I said before, we need to go more into the knowledge economy for every country, so that this model of starting at the low end, getting carried through by the value chain, and then somewhere like Thailand did, for instance. It started with assembly, and then pretty much because everybody in the region was at war at some point or another, had zero competition, so it had some kind of infant industry situation which allowed them to upgrade slowly. But that's not going to happen anymore. And so what really becomes the big problem is what was referred to before, which is the lack of capacity to do nuanced industrial policy, which I really think that it's a big barrier, and it's a reality. We need nuanced industrial policy. We need to think of this complex economy, but we don't have the critical mass on the government side. And finally, on the example of Vietnam, which allows me to conclude that, is do we risk to create more inequalities domestically? And that really goes back to my final point before, where we need to think of the sustainability and so the distribution, and to think about the workers. And in a way, to me, it's gonna happen simply because I think in the last 20 years we've been thinking in terms of comparative advantages of specialization. But actually before the world was trading on varieties, mostly. And as places like China that have largely driven this specialization are getting into the more knowledge-intensive parts of the economy, they are also obliged to get inputs from the world, and so face the costs that their competitor companies in the US or wherever they face. And I think we will see a return much more to trade in variety. If that happens, I really think that there will be, for those countries, developed or developing, that invest in knowledge and in ICT infrastructure. And really, ICT infrastructure, I keep insisting, because it's like wanting to join the Industrial Revolution 2 centuries ago without, getting into the railways or into the steam technology. So we are really at that point right now. And so the countries that will manage to combine these two elements will probably succeed. The ones that are not investing in that, and mine, Italy, is one of those, will probably sink to zero. So.
Yep. World Bank always lets us know how we stand. Now, I've taken lots of questions from the left. We just have time for a few more brief comments, so we'll take, I think, maybe one or two from this side, and then the last one on the right again.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Michelle Chivunga with the University of Surrey, looking at digital transformation, including blockchain and a range of other technologies. My question is really picking up on the point that Dario was saying around ICT and the importance of engaging with technologies. I'm just wondering, trying to understand whether in the various countries you mentioned, there's an appetite to try and engage with these technologies, and if there's appetite to do that. My other second point is around capacity. Obviously, capacity is a huge issue at the minute. I'm just wondering whether there's enough investment going in to help with capacity, especially investing in younger people and engaging them at early stages to look at things like negotiating better trade terms, for example, in Africa and in African countries. Thank you.
I think there's another question on this side. Yeah.
Lily Sommer, African Trade Policy Centre, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in Addis. My question's for Nigel. I tend to completely agree with you that intra-African trade is the way to go. And I think it's important to keep in mind that regional value chains and global value chains aren't mutually exclusive. Of course, more competitive regional value chains is what's attractive to lead firms in global value chains. And also regional connections and linkages are very important to ensure inclusive global value chains, which is, of course, particularly important with the backlash against globalisation. And it seems to be in a lot of platforms, what I've been coming across recently is that there seems to be a perception that there is this trade-off between regional value chains and global value chains. So I was just wondering, as a leading gateway economy somewhat in South Africa, what approach is the government taking to ensure a complementarity between its regional integration agendas and plans and its trade and investment partnerships with the rest of the world?
Thank you. Thank you. We've got a question on this side. Oh, for you then. Okay, and then on this side.
Go for the middle, shall we? So my name is Sophie Varlow. I'm interested in what you said, Nigel. I was really delighted to hear you bring up colonialism, because I think it's a huge factor, and the fact that you even had to sort of censor yourself at that point made me think, where is the debate about the effects and the impacts of colonisation, and what are we doing about that collectively, and is it even a part of the debate?
Interesting question. Over here, was it? Not sure. Is someone on this side? Oh, it's gone. Oh,
sorry.
Yeah, okay.
I'm Anna Guber from Nathan Associates. Given everything that's been said about globalization, and also Max had mentioned bigger challenges, perhaps ideological and cultural, and the effects of immigration, and the solution being potentially through trade and improving global prosperity, what should be the role of the United Kingdom, given the situation we're in at the moment, in supporting trade in developing countries and in economies going forward? So from an aid for trade perspective. Thank you.
Okay, good. I think these are the questions. We've come to the end of our allotted time, but I think with your permission, we could probably have an extra 5 minutes, which gives then 1 minute to each of the panelists. My advice would be to zoom in on just maybe one or two of the interventions, just 1 minute, and wrap up at the same time. Probably start with you, Daria.
I'll pick the first one on new technologies and if there is appetite. I think there is appetite. What is missing is the understanding on how to tap on that appetite. And I think the message we try to give is that it's not about necessarily only creating new technical knowledge and engineering, but really look at the full range of even soft skills, languages, managerial practices, and even the human sciences, which allow to create experts that do not necessarily produce this technology, but are able to navigate the complexity of it. In terms of capacity in the public government, I think the main problem is probably the low wages in the public sector in a lot of countries that make unappealing to go and work for the public sector. In particular, in those countries where there are protected professional services or, for instance, financial services, and so there are rents and the salaries in those protected services are basically crowd out demand from other sectors. Thank you.
Max? Yes, briefly on the role of the UK on this. I think definitely it has a role, and we expect that actually it's a very active role, but I will put this within basically two things to consider. First is that the influence of the UK in trade and development is substantially smaller than it was, more important that many people actually think it has. I think that is very important. And the other thing is that anything that the UK might do in terms of trade and development, I think it would be a good idea to be based on what the beneficiary countries want to get from that. So I think that two things basically: be realistic about the influence that the UK might have, but also paying attention on what the beneficiary countries want from that.
Judy?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just pick up, just to follow on from Max's point about and then the question there. I would just emphasise the point that I was making in the presentation about better understanding how we're integrated in GVCs, using the existing databases, but then also trying to go a bit beyond that. I think there's a really urgent need there. And then, focus on trade costs, because I think however you cut it, trade costs are going to rise. So we need to start sensitising both importers and exporters. That really should be a focus. And then the point about new technologies and blockchain, I very welcome that one. I'm not sure if you know, but the Global Aid for Trade Review, the theme of it this year, and it's next week, I think, is on connectivity. So, people are quite excited about digital trade and the potential there. But there's also concerns around kind of legal frameworks and some security aspects as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Just a few points quickly. I think the point again on the digital, I think there's some great examples in Rwanda, Kenya, Mauritius. I mean, they're really pushing the boundaries, and I think they're leading the way. I think there's a lot more that can be done there. Lily's point on they're not regional and global value chains are not mutually exclusive. I think it's a really excellent point. I think, as I mentioned, I think the big issue is how one can identify and help value chains, help companies within value chains to move from regional to global. I think that's the big focus, and all the support that's required around those firms to get there. Perhaps Sophie's point on colonialization, I think it is still a big issue at a regional level, and I think there is a sort of undertow that comes through, but I think it's become more nuanced also, not just around what happened in the past, but I think now questions around China, South Africa's, let's say, role in the region. But I think politics are very, very significant certainly at an African context, and I think have the ability to perhaps derail any good progress that's made. So I think it's still a very important issue certainly in the Southern African context, and I think at a global level. Then Anna's question, just on having come out of a Wilton Park session, which Max and I were at, I think the big point which came through was do as we say, not as we do, in terms of the UK's view. But I think the one thing which struck me is that for the UK, they have an opportunity now to perhaps move out of some of the protectionist trends that have come through in terms of things like fruit exports. So whereas Spain have got us to have blocked citrus exports because of black spot, which doesn't have any meaningful effect. Now, obviously, it allows the UK to have a more flexible, perhaps, approach. So whether that happens, I don't know, but that's possibly the opportunity that comes through. Thank you.
Thank you. I really must express appreciation to the panelists for their very enlightening set of presentations. I was quite fascinated, and I must say I've learned quite a lot. And so I'm sure some of you would have learned some things new. And our online audience, I do want to thank you. We did have one question from someone out there. Do remember you can continue this discussion, because there will be an opportunity, and I understand via the ODI website to continue to provide some sorts of insights and your own insights and comments. You would be able to get those of you who are online would already be on the site, so I don't need to provide you with any further information on that. So finally then, thank you very much for your participation, and I do hope that some of the policy ideas that have emerged might in some way affect the direction of things. I would hope, but this does not happen, that maybe some major politicians might have been listening to this, but probably doesn't get on to Fox News, so little chance of that. Thank you all very much.